Perfect. Jason's handing out a handout, and I'm going to hand out a door prize. It's a surprise. You guys didn't know? You come here, you get a door prize. Now, I need to have you fill one of these out. Look at Michelle, like, get my pen out here.
That's a good.
Just have one and pass them on, please.
Oh, thank you.
Fill out the door prize, please.
Oh,
Does everybody have a handout?
No, I was hoping, but I
Take it to the guys.
I'll get on this.
okay.
Everybody got a handout?
Oh, we are gonna do that. I'm like,
So while things are being handed out and stuff and being collected, how many people here collect comics, either personally or professionally already? And how many people are here to find out more about what's up with this crazy comics thing?
Well, it's not crazy, I just haven't had the funds.
There you go. Oh, we need another handout?
Handouts right
Here.
here. Oh yeah, it's from over there. Well, welcome everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you for considering comics important enough to choose this session. My name is Jason. I am a children's librarian at the Rochester Public Library. I was on ALA's Great Graphic Novels for Teens for 3 years. I was the chair for the 3rd year, and then this year I was a judge for the Eisner Awards. How many people have heard of the Eisner Awards? Okay, a handful of people.
They're like the Oscars of the comics world.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool.
Yeah, and you know, it's something that I that we will mention at least in passing, but that a lot of times we're coached, we already are used to checking, all of the best books lists that ALA puts out and Caldecott's and all that kind of stuff. And they do have obviously the Great Graphic Novels for Teens list, and then there is they do pick like a quick pick list or something. They do have a kids comics list, but the Eisner Awards is also a great resource for good comics, especially because that includes comics for adults. And it comes out every year. There's about 30 different categories, and the judges pick the nominees for the categories, and then the people in the comics industry will vote on the winners. And so it's worth paying attention to not only the winners, but also to the nominees. Anyway, we can get to that more later. I'm a lifelong comics reader. I read comics from the time I was a kid, Archie comics, and the first comic book I ever had was I had a picture Bible that was Bible stories in comic book form. So that was when I was 6 years old, so it's going back a long ways. And when I became a librarian and sort of discovered that this was a place that I could focus my energies, it was really exciting because it was something that I already loved and was interested in. So it was a natural fit for me to specialize in comics. And I've, talked to college classes and spoken at conferences and things like that. So it's something that I love and passionate about, and I want to make everybody as passionate about it as I am. I feel like comics don't get the attention that they deserve. They are considered sort of like second-class citizens in a sense in the literature world, and part of my mission is to change that perception in people's minds. How many of you ever heard, when either recommending comics or just out and about, somebody make the comment like, well, I also want, my people to read real books. Has anybody ever heard anything along those lines? This is the kind of thing we hear all the time, and comics are real books. So anyway, hopefully you'll learn something, and
Yeah.
that's all I have to say as far as introduction.
Okay, so my name is Xandi DiMatteo, and I am a teen librarian at in the same system in Monroe County as Jason, although I'm at our downtown central branch, and I am fortunate enough to collect comics for teenagers. In my library, we have an adult comic section, a kids comic section, and a teen comic section. And this I think is a great model for a lot of libraries to have. Jason's library has, I think, the kids comics section is the jewel in its crown, but they also have a really great teen
As far
comics
as I'm
section.
concerned anyway.
Of course. And, and recently have been developing an adult comic section because, and that's something we'll talk about later, is like, how do you split, what, you know, like, what are you gonna put where, is kind of a good question. But, to let you know a little bit about my bona fides, I was fortunate enough to carpool and go to library school with Jason. We were in the same class together, and he did a segment on graphic novels. And just so people feel better, if you've never been a lifelong comic reader, if you still struggle with like, I'm not sure I can, it's gonna be your go-to, your comfort thing. I grew up reading print. I love print. I only had the most peripheral knowledge of comics. There's comics, like, but I never really read them. I wasn't like in the life. I don't have a pull list. But I had Jason, and
I
so
won't tell you how many a week I collect.
after Jason blew my mind as a grad student, and then I was fortunate enough to get assigned to Central Library as a teen librarian, which was my goal. The department was a newly created department, and oh, by the way, they had comics. And the lead librarian there really was not comfortable with comics, really was not comfortable with manga, and, which is something I don't say in my system, neither was I. And then I was like, well, snot, what am I gonna do? How am I gonna, I wasn't coming with a built-in knowledge, it wasn't something heavily touched upon in library school, except for Jason. And again, it is a second-class citizen and stuff. So I had roughly 10 shelves. That was all of the comics, all of the graphic novels, all of the manga in one spot. And so it's expanded quite a bit. I would say probably by 100-fold. And of course, when you say why comics, beyond the fact that it's a very popular format, beyond the fact that it is a really great gateway to literacy, especially if you have populations that struggle with reading. This could be English as a second language. This could be people with reading challenges, dyslexia, and all of these things are really dear to my heart because in the city of Rochester, we see a lot of this stuff. And for people who are in the know about comics, it's not necessarily an easy format. You can have very challenging vocabulary, you can have very dense subject matter, you can have really emotional subject matter. So for me, my journey was a little different. I started trying to find out, well, where will I find out about this? Because if anyone has tried to look in professional publications like School Library Journal, like Voya, like I don't know, the thing we get, the flyer about growing minds or whatever, there's not really a good category, there's not a good representation for these things. Depending on who your vendor is, you can get more or less encouragement about graphic novels. So I started trying to talk to comic book fans who usually don't want to talk to librarians because we are not necessarily seen as comic book fans. And so once I said, look I want to make this section better, what do you think I should have? And they told me, and I ordered it, and it was on the shelf. That established a lot of trust, and I got more input from my readers, I got more readers, I made a better collection, I gained more confidence for how I chose things. And honestly, the greatest pinnacle of my professional choices is when Jason says, oh my God, that's so amazing, it totally wasn't on my radar. And it's a huge, I'm like, you know. So, and you know, insufferable, incorruptible, irredeemable, these are all Mark Wade things, and they were just things I was like, yeah, that's probably pretty cool, and I bought it. And I kind of took a chance on it, and I rolled the dice, and I blew people's minds that were in the life, that were hardcore comic book readers. So, and since then, I've become, for teen services, a real go-to person. And MCLS has got genre book lists, and we actually have a comic book list and a manga book list. And it was my pleasure to put those together, and that is, I think, a very great tool when you have people who are more comfortable in a system and they're willing to put these things together and to share their knowledge and to be very transparent about it. And in a lot of our young adult meetings, people, even though we have many people who are themselves manga fans, anime fans, comic book fans, they still will say, Xandi, what are you getting? And so I will tell them. And some people will be like, how do you do this? And I will say, first and foremost, as a teen librarian, because there are some sophisticated storytelling issues that I choose not to have represented in Teen Central, because I have that outlet of a adult section, things like Northlanders, things like I have Northlanders, 100 Bullets, Scalped. These are great comic book serials in and of themselves. There's a place for them. My room is not that place. And I do have things that are very challenging, like, and I get a lot of adult readers who are like, I love it, I'm reading it, I'm getting it here. Why is it in a teen section? Things like Brian K. Vaughan's series, Why the Last Man. I have American Vampire down there, and I have Saga. Saga, I think, is extremely edgy, but I also, for me, it's got a lot of things I'll defend about it for teens. But it's really such a subjective thing, which is why we're here to share what we do.
One thing.
The best thing I do as somebody who's not comfortable is I go to Barnes and Nobles and I go to a local comic book shop and I see what's coming out in trades and I look at stuff. Looking at stuff is really important.
Yeah, because before we get into the links, I did want to piggyback on what Xandi was saying. One thing that I really like to emphasize is that reading comics is a skill, just like anything else. I've encountered librarians who have said, yeah, I read a comic and, it's just, they're not for me. And the challenge that I'd say, well, if you give a first grader A Tale of Two Cities, they're gonna say, yeah, reading is really not for me. So it's really important to make sure that you're picking things to read that are at your comics reading level. So there's things like panel order, there's things like word bubble order, it's about interpreting the pictures and the text together. I've talked to people who are just starting out with comics and they have a hard time, it's like I have to read the word bubble and then I have to look at the picture, but when you've been doing it for a while, your brain is actually able to take both of them in at the same time. And that's something that you just get over time, that you get from learning, from reading, things like that. So I would say that if you understand that they're important, but feel like maybe it's not for you, I would challenge you to think about it in terms of it being a skill as opposed to preference. Because the thing is we're about to find out, there are comics, a broad range of things across all topics, age levels, lots of different things. So that's the next section we're talking about is collection development. On the handout we gave you, the links are pretty self-explanatory. I would like to, I'm going to, Lori, I will email you a copy of this so that you can pass it out, so they'll have the live links. But this is just different websites that you can look at to get ideas for what's out there, recommendations for comics. One that I really like a lot in particular, if you were a children's or teen librarian, is the School Library Journal blog, Good Comics for Kids. It is a really great resource. They review a lot of stuff. They review single issues. They review just across the board stuff from all different publishers. And then a lot of these other places, again, just a sense for looking at what's out there. Some of them divide them up by age level, different things like that.
And I would say something different for me because I am a teen librarian and I do a lot of programming around my thing. When we're talking about these links, there's one called ccgclibraries.com, and this is a great thing to participate in professionally. It's also, it does give you reviews, but it also gives you display promotion and other really cool things. For instance, I'm trying to think about things I've stolen. They have a thing about where you can do a live action clue in your library. So if you have like a robust volunteer group or just enthusiastic teenagers, you want to harness that, they become live, clue pieces. And you can stick with the traditional clue game format, or you could make it a Marvel clue with Marvel characters and Marvel destinations. You can make it, and I know this will be near and dear to Jason, a Star Wars clue and stuff like that. And so you kind of get to see what other people are doing, and by other people I mean some extreme rock stars in other library systems around the country as far as programming and things that will cover more about promoting your collection. And then as far as thinking about, comics and the intersection of pop culture. So if people are into all the Marvel movies and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is very different from the Marvel comic universe and stuff like that, I would say that things like IGN.com is really good. Comic Book Roundup is a real aggregate site, so it pulls in, but they let you know casting choices, what's going on in Arrow, maybe things that are on your radar, but you don't devote your time to watching the Netflix Marvel stuff, Arrow, Lucifer, stuff like that that's on more mainstream TV.
The next batch of links there again, take the time to look this stuff up, and when Lori sends you guys it'll be easier with the live links. But one other important thing too is in terms of advocacy. These are a couple of sites. I wish I brought the one Abdo, but it just gives you some quotes from different studies that show the value of comics in a literacy context. And so a lot of these reading is a superpower, reading with pictures. A lot of these places really are very strong in advocacy for comics. There's a lot of links to studies that show how comics are effective and effective in unique ways. Just a couple of examples would be, for example, studies show that comics readers tend to have better vocabularies than other readers at a similar level, because of course you have additional contextual clues as opposed to the text. You've also got the pictures, which can help kids to understand words that they don't know. You're using more parts of your brain. Even things like superhero comics. If you think about the X-Men, for example, the X-Men's names are vocabulary words. You've got Cyclops, he's got the one beam that comes out of his eye. You've got a character named Banshee whose power is that he screams really loud. And so kids are learning, 10, 15 cent vocabulary words just because the characters that they're named after embody these characteristics. And so there are a lot of ways in which comics can help build vocabulary. Another example is that studies show that comics readers tend to read a wider variety across a wider range of topics because comics readers love the format, so they're drawn to anything that's in that format. And so they'll read nonfiction, they'll read science fiction, they'll read superhero stuff, they'll read across the board, and are drawn to things topics that maybe people would normally be drawn to in other formats. And as we'll get into a little bit too, it's a great way to introduce kids to non-fiction educational topics, to kind of open the door of interest, because they're a lot more accessible than sometimes than prose text or textbook type things or anything with a lot of text is. So
I'm gonna let Jason take a breath, and I'm gonna piggyback on that by saying, beyond the fact that I deal with a lot of English as a second language populations and stuff, also we have a population where they have diminished reading levels for various environmental factors and stuff and urban poverty, rural poverty, they're both poverty. And so I'm sure you guys struggle with a lot of the same things. And so I might have a population where a kid is a 10th or 11th grader with a second grade reading level. Comics can be a really great way to reach that, not just comics, any old comic. You have to choose, as Jason says, something that is at the right level for that person. But DK has got these graphic readers. So these function at like a second grade level. This one is called Instruments of Death, which I like to say to older kids, clearly not for little kids, right? And so it's got a very easy relationship for a novice reader. And I have a bunch of these, even though people have said, why would you have that? It's not that challenging. And I would say that it's such a gateway to literacy and stuff that it might be the boost that kid needs. Now, I also want to say about comics in the classroom. Has anyone here thought about comics supporting classroom curriculum? Because there's a bunch. A a lot of people feel very comfortable with Mouse, and Mouse, of course, is where Art Spiegelman had kind of a memoir passed from his parents who spent time in concentration camps, and there's animalistic representation. So it's kind of, it is very emotional, it is very serious subject matter, and it is based on memoir, but it's also more accessible because of the animals. Now this is a higher level concept. There's some lower stuff. I've got something in my library called The Hammer and the Anvil. This is like where an intersection where Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass are, and so it's got a lot of that attractive stuff, but it definitely supports curriculum for 4th graders, for 8th graders, and for US government, depending on, you know, your reader. I also have a lot of memoir stuff, and a lot of stuff for reluctant readers. For me, it's very easy to justify comics in the classroom. For social studies, there's a lot of science stuff out. And I went to bring you guys, the ones I have there are manga textbooks, and it's like the manga guide to calculus and the manga guide to physics. And so when I was putting this book out, and it's an actual textbook, it's just manga style, and there was a girl, and she goes, "What's calculus?" And I said, "It's really complicated math." And because I'm a librarian, I'm not a mathy person. I said, "It's really complicated math." And she goes, "Huh, well, I don't like math, but I like manga," and like, yoink, and she took it, and I was just like, "Oh, that's kind of bananas." So you can have these sorts of things occur, because it happened right in front of me. So there are really good, you know, in my library, and we'll talk about this later, they end up with a nonfiction designation, and people have been like, "But is this really factual?" And for me, there's a certain disconnect, because I think there's so much more emotional impact that you can get, and there's certain creative license that happens. You can have things like, Journey on the Mohawk, that is done by George O'Connor, and he said, although it's a primary text document, there was one journal entry as an actual Dutch explorer where it says, "The village was full of old men and women and children." And then for 3 days, that's the only journal entry. Well, so the artist is like, "Well, I've got to advance the story, what's going on?" When the explorers hit this village, so like the women are feeding them and pinching their cheeks, and they're flirting with the women, and they're playing with the children, and, you know, clearly that's that emotional response, but did it really happen? Like, we got no clue. Yeah, it's the 1600s. So,
Well,
you know,
that's
but it supports curriculum.
That's a good example too, because, you know, O'Connor actually took verbatim the text of this journal. And so you've got the words of the text, which are a primary resource, and then he used creative license to illustrate it. But here you've got this access point that you might not have had otherwise to this, you know, language from another time, you know, because O'Connor did the work of interpreting some of that stuff. And so, yeah, maybe didn't happen exactly the way that he's imagining that it happened, but I mean, you know, we don't really have any other way of knowing what actually happened, and so it kind of activates the imagination. There's another one I just came across recently that I wish I could remember the title of it, but he takes a Confederate soldier's journal and does the same thing. So he's got the text, the actual verbatim text from the journal, and then he illustrates the panels to just imagine what it might be like, and it makes these primary sources a lot more accessible. So we've kind of moved into now, I just wanted you to take a look at the bottom here where we talk about comics for all tastes and all ages, some categories. So the thing that I would like to, I'm going to try to get through these quickly because this can take a long time. We've got a lot of stuff up here. But the point of it is just a lot of people don't realize what a wide variety of types of comics there are. A lot of people think superhero stuff. You know, people know about some of the autobiographical stuff, but there's really a lot more that's out there. So I just want to kind of quickly go down through the list. And I was thinking I could show what I have, and if you have anything in that category, you can kind of just pop it up.
Well, you start with the word list, and I'll tell my word list story from when I was a children's librarian.
I have what I brought here. This is called Love the Tiger. I like this one because it's really genuinely an all ages book. It is entirely wordless, beautiful illustrations, and it just tells the story of a tiger who's looking for a meal through the jungle. And the thing that can be nice about wordless books is that you can have them for beginning readers. They help with linear thinking, so events in a sequence. I don't know if anybody remembers being in kindergarten and they would jumble up a bunch of pictures. They'd be like, put these in order. You know, essentially you know, they were asking you to put a comic in the right order, you know, plant the seed and you water the seed and the seed grows. They'd say number these in the right order. So this is a pre-literacy skill that everybody needs to learn. It's something that wordless comics, you know, it helps with that. It also helps kids who are pre-readers to be independent. They can look at a book like this, they can get the story without having to read a word. The other thing too, English is a second language. It's good for that kind of thing, giving them access to books. You can talk about what's happening in the picture, good for language practice, and also for older kids too, who struggle with some of this stuff. You know, you give them something like this and they can see that the drawings are more advanced, and you know, it's not something they would necessarily feel embarrassed about reading. And Xandi already talked a little bit about the high interest, low level stuff, but it's the same kind of stuff. You know, something like this where you've got a lot of bright pictures, the text is simple, but kids who are older don't have to feel embarrassed because it's not like you're giving them biscuit or something like that. You know, they're reading something that's interesting to them, but it's at their reading level, and those DK books are a great example of that. And then I was remiss, I did not bring anything from Toon Books at all. How many of you are familiar with Toon Books? They publish beginning reader. They've expanded to include nonfiction and some older graphic novels too, but they publish beginning reader. They actually have the books leveled for different age levels by your typical beginning reader standards, and Stinky won an award, the Seuss Award, I think, a few years ago, and those are also great ways, not just for reluctant readers. Like I want to emphasize that comics are really good for reluctant readers, but not just reluctant readers. It's a great way for anybody to jump into reading and to become accustomed to it in a really fun way, in an engaging way. So
Okay, let me tell my story about a wordless comic, because long ago in a far off galaxy, I got my start as a children's librarian, and I was on this committee to do a reading list for fifth graders into sixth graders. And I was really wanting to have some comics put on this reading list, and I was dealing with a lot of very traditional minded people. They were like, well, this is fifth grade and sixth grade, and so I chose the safest choice I thought I could make, and I was like, let's use Robot Dreams by Sarah Varon. And I just thought about it because it's an amazing story, and it's such a great thing for that group when you're dealing with like friend stuff and people who aren't being very good friends, like a lot of emotional stuff. Anyone here familiar with Robot Dreams? It's been out for a long time. It's very safe, right? So I was like, we got to use Robot Dreams. Somebody said, no, you can't use Robot Dreams. It's wordless. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess it is. I guess it is wordless. But one person like burst into tears, and she said, you can't use it. It's so sad. And I was like, that's why we need to use it, because it evokes that emotional response, because it is such a great story about what is friendship, what kind of friend should you be, how should you treat people, and if it's getting that kind of emotional response out of an adult, what's it going to do for a fifth grader? So wordless, really, as Jason says, can be a great thing. It's not just for little kids. So
The Arrival by Sean Tan is another great example of and these are some things that are also very complex too, and that, you know, require, again, that skill of reading graphic novels that somebody who's never, you know, you wouldn't give that. I wouldn't give The Arrival to a 5-year-old because it's too dense. So I think that it's important to note that wordless comics are for all ages. We've got, of course, like in anything, you've got genres, sci-fi, fantasy, superhero stuff. I've just got like a few examples.
Right.
I wanted to prop this here, David Chelsea's Snow Angel. It's about a girl who her power is that she makes a snow angel in the snow, and then she turns into a superhero that flies. But it's very the kind of stuff that she does is like she saves kittens out of trees, and it's very accessible, you know. But it's very much like a superhero type of a thing. And this is something I don't think a lot of people know about it, but it's really quite lovely, and I think it's just great for that kind of crossover. You've got a strong female protagonist, and you've got you know, superhero stuff happening, but it's not in that kind of real macho sort of way. And then, you know, of course, I'm just going to show what I have. I'm sure most people know about Rainy Telgemeier. This is her newest book, Ghosts. Rutabaga the Adventure Chef. I like this one because he doesn't fight, he only cooks, but he goes on these epic adventures anyway, and he assists the people who fight, so he's got something to offer, even though he's not a
Amen, an army
fighter.
lives on its stomach.
So I love this because it's like you can have an adventure even if you're not a fighter, so that's really nice. Zeta the Space Girl, also something strong female protagonist, but great crossover appeal for boys and girls, both like this. We've got Nameless City, Faith Erin Hicks is her newest one.
Really,
It's kind of a historical,
Faith Erin Hicks, anything, you can't go
Yeah.
wrong.
and of course your typical superhero stuff. Here's Batgirl, for the 21st century. Gotham Academy, again, a great upper elementary, junior high kind of crossover appeal. So it takes place in Batman's world, but its characters are they're school children, and they interact with, cross paths with Batman, but, they're not necessarily superheroes themselves. One of my favorite series, the Hilda series, that is really quite lovely, beautiful artwork on the inside, complicated layouts, a great mythology. There's like 4 or 5 books in the series now. Really fun stuff. What have you got for
Alright,
genre fiction?
So, in fantasy, has anyone seen Foiled by Jane Yolen? This is Curses Foiled again, and I love how it takes that woman clinging to the hero's leg and flips it. And there's another panel in here where she and this guy who's actually a troll are on a bus, and he's kind of thick, and he says something, and she's like, she thinks to herself like, God, he's so dumb, it's good he's pretty, and so this is really subversive in some really quiet ways, and this actually has quite a lot of diversity beyond the girl thing, because she has a cousin who's in a wheelchair, and in this adventure, her cousin who's in a wheelchair comes with them on the adventure, and she is not a problem, she's an asset, and so Curses Foiled again is really fantastic.
Say something about that too. One thing that's really cool about this series is that when she's in sort of the real world, it's in black and white, and then when she enters into the fantasy world,
The magical world.
it becomes, or the magical world, it's in color. And so this is, again, one of those things that you can communicate in a graphic novel using sequential art that is really hard to do as effectively in any other format. So that's one of the things that is really striking about graphic novels, and there are ways in which they can communicate story
Yeah.
that are really unique apart from anything
And
else.
I want to say that in the genre of teen literature in general, where you have all these romantic triangles and it's all about the romance, which is cool because teens love it and whatever, Alara is much happier being alone. Like, she is just like really happy to be alone. And so that is not something that girls get exposed to, which is pretty cool. Now, anyone familiar with Kamala Khan? Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel. So Ms. Marvel used to be kind of a side thing to Captain Marvel, who was historically a guy, and that's a whole nother conversation topic. But Ms. Marvel is amazing because she's a teenager, she's a Pakistani teenager, she's Muslim, and the creator of this herself is Muslim and stuff, so you get a lot of diversity, authenticity on this. And she struggles a lot with, who am I going to be? What is going to be my function? Rather than kind of like take kind of an easier path by going into a superhero conclave, she says like, I'm from Jersey City. Jersey City needs help. Jersey City is struggling. I'm going to protect. I'm going to be the hero for Jersey City. And initially this starts out, and the hero is kind of ridiculous. He's a man with a bird head. And then what you find out is that he is pulling in disaffected teens, disconnected teens, and he's telling them that their only value is to be an energy source. And so how she fights him best is to say, no, you have more to offer, you're unique, you can be amazing, you are amazing, don't give up on yourself. And so, such a really great positive message.
And Ms. Marvel is a great entry point into comics, period.
Yeah.
People who are first-time comic readers love Ms. Marvel. She's a great entry point into superhero comics. So Marvel really
Across the
big
board,
win with Ms. Marvel.
because Marvel has been doing some things that the fans struggle with, like they do things like they turn Thor is now the goddess of thunder, and they're like, but Ms. Marvel is beloved by all Marvel fans. The Kamala Khan character and stuff is really like, you don't hear anyone go, Ms. Marvel wasn't all that. They love it.
There's definitely tension in the sort of collector's world because Marvel's been doing controversial things like making Thor a woman and
Yeah.
and this kind of thing, but it's really working because it's bringing in more people, it's bringing in more, girls and women,
Right.
bringing people from other,
Right.
other ethnicities, really expanding the appeal in that way.
Arrow is really popular on TV, mainstream. One of the characters from the Arrow DC universe is Black Canary. I chose her because she's not part of the Batverse. There's amazing stuff coming out of the Batverse. I think it is the hottest property, but Black Canary, I think the Black Canary and Zatanna teenage storytelling stuff is, I think, right now the best of what's coming out of that Arrow universe. There's Flash, but the Arrow stuff is kind of weak, and so this has got some really great stuff, and Black Canary is kind of she's good, but she's not that good. She's kind of a reluctant anti-hero kind of thing, so that was kind of cool. Anyone seen Princeless? So Princeless is from, not a mainstream publisher, it's from, I think it's Action Lab Entertainment. Yeah, it's Action Lab. And Princeless is, it's a kingdom. Her father's the king, her mother's the queen, they're both people of color. She's a person of color. And it is just the way it is in this fantasy kingdom. The girls get locked up in a tower, then a knight has to come rescue them. Hers is guarded by a dragon. She is really irritated. She thinks that's a stupid idea. So she gets locked up in a tower and she springs herself. She takes off on the dragon. They fly away to have adventures and to free the other princesses, her sisters, that are locked up. And they meet this girl who, her father is the blacksmith, but he's also a drunk. And so she's taking care of the shop. And so what I really like about this is she's in the armor of the knights who perished due to the dragon. So this isn't like super child friendly, I think, but then they acknowledge the superheroines that have come before. Wonder Woman, Xena, Warrior Princess. She's like, this is the woman's collection for armor. And Red Sonja, especially the chainmail bikini. And the girl goes, wouldn't that give you a wedgie? And the armor girl says, the short answer is yes. And she goes, the long answer is much worse. And so it's really hilarious. And then she's got this thing which is basically like catcher's mitts over the bosoms. And she's just like, no, just no. And so they realize that maybe they need to have like a functional costume that, is really made for a woman. And so this is, got a really great pro-girl message. In my library, our children's room does have it. And the one I recommend to you is a spin-off from that called Raven the Pirate Princess. And she's Asian, and she's a lesbian, and she's got an all-girl pirate crew. And so, that's it's kind of in your face, but I kind of love it, and it's very humorous. Also, anyone remember Gem and the Holograms? I just brought this for nostalgia, but this is actually really well done.
I brought it too.
Nothing I love more than a big burly comic book dude who's like, you got Gem and the Holograms, and I'm like, of course. And then, Unbeatable Squirrel Girl. She's going to college. She's been hanging out like a squirrel in the Avengers attic, the Avengers mansion. She's been babysitting Luke Cage's kid with Jessica Jones. She's got squirrel powers. It's ridiculous. And she does have super strength. She's super agile. She's got all these, she can command a squirrel army. But really, she talks people out of stuff. She talks Craven out of just killing for killing's sake. And she's like, you should think big, you should go here. And she diverts him from the mayhem he's going to cause and stuff. So I love Squirrel Girl, and that is just but it's great in a teen area, and comic book dudes also love this as well, and it's ridiculous in the spring from the 90s. All sorts of stuff, crazy stuff happened in the 90s. So I don't know.
Next we've got, we're going to try to get through this quickly here. So we've got historical, nonfiction, biographical. I kind of lumped them together because, as Xandi said, sometimes you'll have a non-fiction-y, that's something that's popular in comics, is where they'll base something off of a true story, but for the sake of moving the story along, they'll sometimes combine characters, combine 10 scientists into 2 scientists, but a lot of times in these comics they'll have what's called panel discussions at the end, and if you look, there's notes, and a lot of the good non-fiction-y comics will discuss what they've changed, why they've changed it, there's links to sources. Also, historical fiction, this is a new one by Hope Larson, kind of takes place in the past, like sort of stowaway kids. We've got other things. This is like sharks, top 10 deadliest sharks. This is a great series. Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales. He covers, he's got World War I. There's a book about Harriet Tubman. There's
The
a book,
Donner Party.
The Donner Party, yeah. And well, and the thing is that for even for something like that, it's really cool because it's such a, it could be so gory, but he handles it in a very entertaining way. So this is a great series. This is more for adults. Shigeru Mizuki does a series on the history of Japan in manga format. So again, making something that might be less accessible, more accessible for a lot of readers.
I want to say, just to piggyback on that, there's a series called Barefoot Gen, which is a hero who comes out of the ruins of Hiroshima. It's heartbreaking, but post-World War II bombings and stuff, it's very, very interesting.
Here's a biography of Alan Turing from the Imitation Game that came out recently. I've got here is a biography of Karl Marx. And again, as I said before, a great way even to sort of introduce people to the basics of a life, because obviously you can't go into as much detail, but you can at least kind of captivate someone's imagination, lead them to more detailed reading. This is a hip hop family tree. Pisker goes through the history of hip hop starting from like the late 1970s. Very, very detailed, very entertaining. I learned so much from reading these.
And
Also in this category would be autobiographical comics, which, you know, a lot of people know about, but that would be like Smile and, you know, other things, like Xandi's got some here too.
Viet in America is the story of G.B. Tran and how his parents came from Vietnam and they never talked about the old country. He's first generation immigrant. And of course, he was always very much encouraged to be English, to be successful, to be American. And so he never knew the circumstances that drove them from the country. And he hadn't, but somebody important in their family passes away. And of course, it was necessary for the family to travel back to give honor to the person who passed away. And so he finds himself meeting the family that was never talked about, and the family he never knew, and to visit the culture he had never seen. And so there are panels that talk about the French occupation of Vietnam, the circumstances that made the family leave, and they have a subdued color palette as well. And let me see if I can find one of the ones. My favorite picture I probably should have marked, but he ends up eating all this super spicy Vietnamese food, and then there's this big fist fight and drunken brawl occurring in his stomach. And it is so delightful. So it is. It's a really, really fantastic thing, and to see the intersection of the culture and the history and stuff like that. And so actually, I got this on the city school list for the upper grades and stuff as memoir fiction, because everybody is very comfortable with Mouse, which again comes under the same umbrella. Persepolis. Everybody's heard about Persepolis and how great that is.
I just want to gripe for a second, like, I can't tell you how many people have come in and they're saying, I'm taking an introduction to literature course, and they're still reading Mouse and Dark Knight Returns. And like, there's so much more that's been published since then. This is a part of like my whole like frustration. It's like you can see we've got tons of stuff here. I mean, this is just a fraction of what's out there.
Yeah.
Let me tell you, like, when I went into the room as an Eisner judge, we're talking like a conference room, maybe about half this size, like walls, like stacks of books, like books. There's 30 categories, there's like 30 submissions, each category, all different categories. There's so much stuff out there, and people are still reading Mouse and Dark Knight Returns and Intro to Literature courses, and it's driving me crazy.
So this is something that's been out for a while, and it's going to be very timely with the Birth of a Nation coming out and stuff. This is the story of Nat Turner, and he led a revolt. He was a slave. He rose up against and encouraged a bunch of other slaves to basically murder the white property owners in the South. And it is very emotionally evocative and nearly wordless, except for the fact that the only words that it has are actual text and transcripts from the trial of Nat Turner at the time, which is itself a little biased. And again, this is not for the faint of heart. It's a very violent episode in history, and not many people mention it when we talk about history because it's very violent and he's not an easy hero to wrap your hands around. Now this, Max Brooks, World War Z, Mel Brooks's kid. This is his personal passion project, was to do the Harlem Hellfighters. This is about a unit of African American soldiers that participated in World War I. We've never heard about them because sadly, they were never recognized by the United States military. This is before soldiers were integrated into it. They never lost a soldier in all their battles, and they saw some very bloody battles. And ultimately, they were all recognized for their military service and heroics by the French. But it is an amazing story, it's an amazing book, and I highly, highly recommend it. This is another one that I got. My goal is to get the AP classes, integrating comics, but this was recommended for the 11th graders. So, that's what I got.
Another category.
Oh, one more thing, sorry about this. There is something called Campfire Graphics, and they have a lot of biography. They're very safe to get because they're not terribly gory. Campfire Graphics has got some great retellings of classic literature. They've also got a lot of biographies. This is Muhammad Ali, but they also did Steve Jobs, Genius by Design. Really, really fantastic biography. And also they do historical breakouts, like 400 BC. And they do a lot of mythology. So they'll have some great Greek mythology stuff, but they also have a lot of diverse mythology stuff.
What's cool about this imprint too is that it's actually an Indian imprint. So the writers tend to be, like European or English or whatever, but then almost all of the artwork is done, by Indians. So it's kind of a cool sort of meeting of worlds. Next category, adaptations. The thing that, lots of adaptations. This is a great series adapting Wizard of Oz. So we've got classic literature, we've got The Lightning Thief. This is something that's more contemporary. Some people say, well, why would you read this instead of reading the original? And I would say, number one, in terms of an educational setting, somebody who wouldn't go near the original might read this and be like, holy cow, that's a great story. I'm gonna go to the source text, and read it. Similar to people who would watch a movie and then wanna read the book after the movie. You can use that in the same way. Also, for people who don't have a problem going either way, it's really interesting to read an adaptation after having read the original. You can have discussions about, why did the artist choose to illustrate this? What did they leave out? Why did they leave it out? Do you think they should have put this in? Or that kind of stuff. Having discussions about adapting, the process of adapting, and it's a great way to get a new perspective on a book that you might be familiar with, seeing it from a different
And I just want to
angle.
say about the Rick Riordan stuff, it's as much a phenomenon right now as Harry Potter was, but you do have kids who can't manage those thick books. And I did have some kids who obviously I think had some very high energy levels that might have been on a clinical scale, and they were so thrilled to check those books out because now they could read what their brothers, their
Right.
sisters, the rest of their friends were reading. They could be part of that movement, and again, that's just another side door for literacy and allowing them to participate in that pop culture moment.
And there are a lot of, even adaptations of adult novels, lots of that kind of stuff is going on. And again, it's interesting because you get another perspective. It's a person's personal take on a story.
Here's one that came out, this is a nostalgia factor, my copy wasn't on the shelf. Anyone grow up in the 80s and remember The Girl Who Owned a City? That was like one of those books where all the adults die and the teenagers and kids gotta survive on their own. It was not an award winner. But they've done recently an adaptation of it, and I'm like, cool! It's been repackaged for another generation. That's kind of bananas.
One thing that's important too in the next category, comic strips and reprints. The one thing I want to say about comic strips, and again, I'm always looking at things from a children's librarian perspective, but if you think about, when I realized this, I understood so much why Garfield is so popular, because what happens is you've got immediate payoff. So if you are someone who struggles with reading, all you've got to do is get through 3 panels, and then you have the laugh. And the thing that's great about that is that laugh then carries you over to the next strip, and so you just want to keep reading. So I've seen parents discourage their kids from reading comic strips, it's tough to see that, and I always encourage them to say, no, it's all right, because what you're doing is you're fostering a love of reading in children. And so if they have that payoff, they want to keep reading, they want to keep going, and they don't have to invest a whole lot to begin with. So that's one way, aside from just being funny and well written, that comic strips can be a great way, again, to encourage literacy in kids.
And let's remember too, that includes comic comic strips like Calvin and Hobbes and Bill the Cat and Opus, Burke Reithley, Berkeley Reithley, thank you. And I was trying to think of the county. Bloom County, thank you, which has seen a resurgence. And on my level at my library, the one I have a hard time keeping on the shelf, Boondocks by Aaron Magruder and stuff. And they bring up some high concepts and done in a very witty way. And my gateway into getting teachers, because my mom's a teacher, she's a comic book fan from her adolescence, lapsed comic book reader, now she's a high school teacher. And I said, how can you expect your kids to follow the comic, the like Thomas Nast comic that they have to write an essay about, and then in the same token say comics have no value? Because we are having kids, like we're judging them on how they can read a comic panel and do that visual storytelling, so.
One thing that's really important that I see woefully underrepresented is classics in comics as well. So something people are like, what's popular, what are people reading now, particularly in children's literature. I try to make it a point to go back. This is just, I brought as a collection, but this is, Craig Yo collected a bunch of, comics from like the 30s and the 40s, and so going back a long time, I've got collections of Little Orphan Annie strips from like the 20s and 30s. I can tell you, I know children who've read those multiple times over. So in terms of literacy, overall, like literature, it's really important to represent the history of comics. And yeah, it's got a shorter history than other classic literature, but it's really important. Little Lulu, kids will read Little Lulu. There's a lot of stuff too, even for adults, things that kind of go back, and it's really important to represent that comics history. I've also got the Marvel reprint in the Marvel Masterwork series, old superhero comics. What I love about these too is that I have a lot of these in my kids' collection. This stuff from the 60s tends to be much tamer than a lot of the superhero stuff that comes out now. There are imprints. Marvel has ones that are aimed towards kids. They're really not as well written, I have to be honest. So you've got stuff that's more high concept, more developed vocabularies, but stuff that content-wise is not gonna scare any parents away. And so it's great if you can get copies of old, like they have like a Batman series that just does chronologically Batman issues from the start. There's like 10 volumes, and they go through entire Batman, World's Finest plus Batman plus Detective Comics. And kids like it. They like reading the old stuff.
And let me just say about this in my library, I have more of the current superhero stuff. And so my collection goes from like the 70s on forwards, and the art division has got the 70s on backwards. And they have like the Golden Age, Silver Age, and they have a lot of those historic comic strips and stuff, and that helps establish some pretty good boundaries for our collection. And then there's kind of that weird no man's land where just crazy stuff happens, and we fight over them. And the adult comic book librarian is a hardcore Batman fan, and it's killing her not to have the new stuff out. So to throw her a bone, because I'm a generous person, I let her have Batman 66. Because if you're not aware of Batman 66 and you love the old Batman TV show, dude, check out Batman 66. It's bananas. So, and I just wanted to, there was something I was going to piggyback on about your comic book strips. I forgot. I lost it. All right, never mind. I'm sure it's good.
Well, I want to make sure we get to talk about promoting a little bit. So
Yes.
let's try to, the last few categories, we could do a whole thing on manga. We brought some representation. You guys all know that it's really popular. There's a lot of resources out there to find good stuff. One thing that I want to mention that a lot of people may not know about is that there's a lot of, who's heard of Tintin? Who? Okay, so most of you, all right. There's a lot of other stuff that's actually from the Franco-Belgian tradition. So Cinebook puts out a lot of stuff that's actually translations of stuff that came out in the 70s, 80s. You may have heard of Asterix. There's Lucky Luke, but there's a lot of other stuff too. One of my favorites is Yoko Tsuno. This is kind of it's like Nancy Drew, meets science fiction meets. I can't tell you what it means.
It's bananas.
But she's a detective. She's I believe she's Japanese, and know, there are elements of science fiction, there's historical stuff, there's time travel, there's just straight up mystery, really, really interesting kind of stuff. Kids who get turned on, Blue Coats takes place in the Civil War era, kids who get turned on to these will read anything. If you have kids who like Tintin, like, they'll read pretty much anything else. There's a lot of similarities in the storytelling style, and again, as you can see, like, this is, like, nobody can tell you that this is not reading. I mean, there is so much text, there's a lot of images going on, you know, again, you know, they're not, in France, they have, France and Japan both, actually, there wasn't anything like, they didn't have a Frederick Wortham, who basically just cut the comics off by the knees. There was a Senate subcommittee, basically comics were kind of vilified and sort of pushed out. They said that comics were harmful for kids, all this kind of stuff, and just like practically comics had to start from the ground up. That never happened in Japan and France. You've got people in Japan, you'll see more people reading manga on the subway in Japan than you'll see reading prose text. You'll go to grocery stores, and instead of magazines in France, you'll see rows of comic books. So they're telling advanced stories, they're not dumbing down. They believe that, you know, this is literature just like anything else. And so it's really important to represent these traditions in our,
Can I talk about a single voice?
yes.
Alright, so, there's, you know, you gotta collect what you're comfortable with manga, and, obviously going to see it is a really important thing, because there's something called fan service, and that's where things can get kinda edgy, because manga is not necessarily published for children, but there's a rating system, and you can check out the rating system. Generally, if you're collecting for teens or kids, and what you're gonna look at is cellophane wrap, probably a good example, you don't want it in your collection. A Silent Voice is a really good story, though. It is about a boy and a young girl who's deaf, and their first intersection, the young girl is deaf, and the boy initially bullies her. It's kind of a peer pressure driven thing, and then she just disappears from the school, and like they don't see each other, and then they reconnect, and he's kind of got to come to terms with what he's done and kind of own it and take responsibility for it, and it's, you know, their relationship. So obviously there's stuff that is more kind of realistic relationship driven stuff in manga, and then there's also stuff that is more fighting and action oriented. The more realistic stuff where everybody's very pretty is called shonen, or I'm sorry, shoujo, and then the action stuff is shonen. And it's more fighting and stuff. I'm not gonna say it's boy stuff, because I get more girls that want the shonen stuff than the shoujo stuff. And I've got a huge crossover of boys who love the shoujo stuff, so you can't really predict.
And this is actually something that's more older teens, adults. I love the series. It's like a cross between Indiana Jones, MacGyver, and Sherlock Holmes. So this guy's really, lots of really interesting stuff goes on. Just real quickly, comics for girls is something, it's just, girls are coming to comics more and more in droves. Raina Telgemeier is largely responsible for a lot of that. More stuff's being published. You know, it's important to make sure that you know, this is a part of expanding the format, a part of opening it up to a wider audience, and so it's really important. It's a lot easier these days too, because there's a lot more out there. The Eisner Awards this year were notable for nominating like significantly more women creators than ever had been in years before. So women are really getting their day in comics. It's really exciting. There's a lot of good stuff out there. Roller Girl was a Newbery honor winner. So that's just something that I wanted to kind of highlight. It's actually a lot easier these days than it used to be. It used to be more like, I would say, there's just these few things, make sure you buy them, because it's important that girls have stuff to read. But
And Jason was the first person to tell me about Minx. It was what I refer to as Marvel's apology to girl readers. And it's got a lot of strong girls. I thought Minx was Marvel, it's DC, okay,
DC.
anyways, thank you, Jason, you would know. So Minx was a thing for a girl audience. The girl characters are primary. Romance is possible, but not the goal. Like they might crush on somebody, but like in the Regifters one, the kid she crushes on is in her martial arts class, and then they're at this tournament, and and she's really good at martial arts, and they're gonna be in a bout together, and he kind of is like, yeah, you want to throw it, and then like her crush dies, and so But it used to be, I used to go for all of my minks and kind of cherry pick through the minks, and there weren't a lot of them out there.
It's a shame too about the imprint, there was a really lot of good stuff,
I know,
it was
so
ahead of
much.
its time, honestly,
Yeah.
the industry wasn't ready for it, and they ended up canceling the imprint because they weren't getting the sales.
Yeah.
So media properties, this is a no-brainer, especially in kids' comics. I just brought a few. You've got your stuff, lots of, you've got Minions, you know, we've got Powerpuff Girls are coming back again. This is not a media property, that's the Comics for Girls, Lumberjanes, very popular. Adventure Time, lots of Adventure Time comics, very popular. I also brought Gem and the Holograms. Plants vs. Zombies, I was like, no thanks. But it was something that was submitted for the Eisners, and so I was very surprised to find a video game that has pretty much no plot. Paul Tobin has created this really kind of madcap, surreal world, just with a lot of humor,
Yeah.
crazy characters. It's really a fun series, and so I am so happy to recommend this to kids, because the moment you're like, we got a Plants vs. Zombies comic, they're like, what? You know, all of a sudden a kid who's not interested in reading now is like, give me that, you know, and that's the most satisfying thing as a librarian. And I always say, you know, if you want kids to read, you've got to present them with stuff they're interested in. That's the key, because then they're gonna work to get that information, to read that, you know, as opposed to the other way around. You gotta learn to read because everybody wants to read, or everybody needs to learn how to read, as opposed to, you know, let me tantalize you, you know, dangle the fruit, and they'll do the work that they need to do on their own.
To piggyback on the media properties, I wanna say from a teen perspective, Dragon Age, video game, got a really great comics run out based on that world building. Also, the Halo stuff, is pretty good,
Yeah,
and
the older video games too.
Yeah,
same-
yeah,
same
yeah.
kind of thing.
and, actually in a kind of a weird reverse way, iZombie started life as a graphic novel that was kind of like, 4 volumes, petered out, but now it's an amazing television thing, so that street can run both ways.
So we've got about 10 minutes left. I actually kind of want to, we'll skip ahead to the questions, but I do want to point out on the back what we have here in terms of promoting. Again, we could do a whole separate thing on this. This stuff is self-explanatory, and if you have questions about these things in particular, you can ask them in the question section. But, you know, kind of read through that. These are some really great, simple ways to promote comics in your library. And I want to just talk really quickly too in terms of promotion. I'll also put out single issues. We process them like magazines, so you get the pocket and you can check them out like a magazine. Minimal processing, a couple of pieces of tape. They last a lot longer than you think. You know, really accessible. Kids like these because you can kind of grab it and stick it in your pocket. Kids who are just waiting for their parents will often pick up single issues and read them. So this is something that really is great to add to the collection.
Let me spend 2 minutes talking about cataloging of the collection. In my library, we had a very stubborn cataloger. I had to wait for him to retire, not die, thank goodness. But all of my comics in my building were done with a Dewey 741.5973 or 741.5952. And I love catalogers because, man, they do that work I can't do. I'm not that detail oriented. But I had to do some of the heavy lifting myself to create a system. Now, for the lifelong fan, like Jason, you're like, we're going to use the comic book store method. I am too far removed from processing and cataloging to do that. So I kind of read a library journal article on comics and how to present comics, how to organize comics, and I came up with my own system based on that article's input. So I have DC and Marvel have their own areas because it's so rare to get an intersect with the fans. And then everything not explicitly Marvel or DC superhero, I have to clarify that because now that Marvel has Star Wars, the Star Wars started life with Dark Horse and the green dots I have. And I did use dots. I got Marvel has a red dot because Marvel's in red. DC's got a blue dot because you can see it's rocket science in Libraryland. And then everything else has got a green dot now. Then I just use the creator's name. Sometimes there's anthologies. If there's a Batman anthology, it goes under BAT. Deadpool gets a little murky. Sometimes it's just under DEA. But I like to honor the creator, and so that's how I do it. Ideally, comic book fans want things in character order, but then you have storylines that involve multiple superhero groups, Civil War, Secret Wars, whatever's happening in the Batverse, with the Court of the Owls and stuff like that. And so that would really, like, I'd have to spend more time thinking about it than I wanted to. So that's why I go by creator.
I have a shelf basically, and I have one side that says property and the other side that says author. And so I will separate, I kind of lump superhero stuff, other things that have a source in other media. So superhero plus, if it's based on a video game, if it's based on a TV show, I will go by the property. So Powerpuff Girls is all under POW. And then if something was created by the author, then it goes under author. So that's kind of the way that I do it, because it's really important, if nothing else, like you gotta have all your Spider-Man comics in the same spot, because people are just not gonna know where to find them otherwise. So you've gotta be a little bit creative in how you catalog. Like she does the Marvel DC thing, I don't do that. You can also see when you come and look up, I've got stuff from different collections, and feel free to ask questions too about the different ways we've got things cataloged. But speaking of questions, I wanna make sure you guys get a chance to ask questions, so now would be the time to ask any questions that you might have. I know we threw a lot of stuff at you, so, yes.
I was wondering on here you put no non.
Oh, yes, thank you. Take your pen and write a T, there should be a T after that.
Oh,
Not
not.
nonfiction, yes. I'm sorry, I should have clarified that.
But I do wanna
I believe very strongly that every kids, teens, and adults pull that out of nonfiction, give it its own shelf space. Even if you have just a couple of shelves, give comics their own shelf space. It's a completely different format. It's not nonfiction. It's not like anything else, and it
Jason,
deserves its own space.
Hold on a second, because I'm about to say, I couldn't break free from my cataloging department. Some things they have determined as nonfiction, some of that memoir stuff, some of that stuff based on, if the Library of Congress gave it a thing, they're giving it a thing. And so, like, a lot of they've determined it's nonfiction. It's
Well, I mean, you
But do
may.
you still shelve it with a comic?
I do.
Right, yes.
They've got
I
their
would
own
still
section.
put like we have, our adult comics collection is split up into fiction and nonfiction. So there's a fiction side on, but it's all in its own section. The thing about that is that your biggest, the people who are gonna circulate that stuff the most are the comics fans. So it's better, rather than spreading nonfiction comics throughout the fiction section, put them together. And that way, people who aren't necessarily comics readers, as a librarian, as a reference librarian, you can still, the idea is that it's a part of our job is to expand people's minds about these things. Because like the thing about schools that I have found out is that my library is one of the only places where kids are actually gonna get comics recommended to them. And so we have a really important job in terms of promoting comics, because they're not getting that completely outside of the library. And so even if you've got adults coming in and they say, well, do you have books about the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion? Say, well, I've got this, this, and this, and also there's this graphic novel. Like, bring it all in there. Give them the opportunity. They can say they don't want it, but sometimes people say, oh, I didn't even know, that looks really interesting, and they'll grab that. So
And
that's
I'm in a
part of
central
selling this stuff.
library, which is broken into divisions. It's 2 buildings, 8 different floors, and a lot of the divisions are starting to recognize the validity and the popularity, because when push comes to shove, it serves when it's a graphic novel. And so, like our science division, science, history, and travel is especially good. They have a lot of materials that are actually graphic novels, because they are and because our cataloging department's giving them like a 900 number, or a corresponding 500 number for math and stuff like that. So it's out there, it's of value, it's important, and it's enough of, like, we're from small libraries, big libraries, but small libraries. But I went to Book Expo, and the person who was in charge of teen services for the Brooklyn Public Library, and she was telling me about her biggest accomplishment of her career was getting the graphic novels broken out. She's like, I had to do battle with catalogers, and I'm like, I feel ya.
And that's
stuff,
what this make a resource and advocacy committee, because I have had librarians tell me that they've had trouble with administration in terms of doing that. And so, like, get more people.
Library
who are on
Journal's
the
got a
same
good
page.
article. You might have to
know.
search it. It came out a while ago. It's worth it.
But if you get a group of people together who are advocating for that, who, and again, on the other side, statistics, research, all that kind of stuff, it's all there. The information is there, the justification, it's there. So anyway, yes, more questions?
More questions.
Yes.
This is kind of like reader advisory. I have a patron who's really into graphic novels, and he's gone through, and everything that I had, most of the stuff that's in the system, he's gone through. So is there like a website or resource that's you know, I've kind of gotten a taste for what he likes. And so trying to find more comic books that he doesn't know about, but that will kind of fit to his taste, is there a good resource for that?
I mean, I guess depending on what, you know, what he likes, I think similar to, you know, sometimes you have to be more creative, you know, doing internet searches, cause, you know, something like Novelist is not always gonna have a great selection of comics.
Amazon, I hate to say it, that strip, if you like this, then you might like this. People are also buying that, sometimes you can have like 20 pages.
The other thing too is connect with your local comic shop, you know, these guys know a lot about this stuff, and so that's another great place, you know, to go, is, you know, if you like this, then you like this kind of a thing. It can be tricky because, like I said, you have to piece together information about comics.
And you can ILL a lot of stuff too, like the majority of my collection goes out by browsers, but I have a core of people checking stuff out. The ILL guy is always in my division.
And you can also email us, because our email addresses are right up there, so
Yeah.
if you have any questions about anything, please feel free to email us. Go ahead.
Okay, I have a few things. First of all, I took a honors college course my freshman year, and it was just the literature, and when we got in there, our entire course was Shakespeare graphic novels.
Wow.
For the entire semester, so that was like my first exposure. Second, how do you guys obtain your single issues for circulation? Because they're not really available, like we use Ingram for ordering. So
I get
like,
them from the comic shop.
Now, do you have like something set up with them where they help hold like each new issue of the ones you have aside?
I have done that in the past, like you can set up a pull list, you know, with the comic shop, and if we didn't say what that means, pull list, basically you tell them what titles you want, and every month they'll set aside the stuff that you want for you. So you can pick titles and they can set up a pull list, and you can arrange to come in every month or whatever, get the stuff that you got. My comics person will, gives a 20% discount. You can actually, if you are buying in quantity, a lot of, in my experience, comic shop owners are happy to help get comics out there, and if you breach the subject, or broach the subject, you know, and say, hey, you know, if I give you sort of X amount of business or whatever, can you give me a discount? A lot of times they'll be willing to work with you on that.
And in my library, we go through EBSCO, where we get the rest of our periodicals, and Marvel has serialized contract in DC, but then you end up having a lot of mainstream stuff. And so the art division was providing it as a service to bring in those single issues, and it was like Amazing Spider-Man, it was X-Men, it was Avengers, it was Batman, but it was really, really mainstream stuff. And like, I decided not to do it because we're moving and because it can be a little bit of a hassle, and I was like, let's let the dust settle from our construction, and then I'll revisit it for next year.
What about back issues?
It just depends on
Can you still get
availability.
them there?
Same thing, at a comic shop, they may have some left over, but if you wanna have successive issues, it's easier to kind of start up fresh. I mean, it's just about having stuff out there. I'm not as concerned about having any kind of complete collection, because it's just kind of, like, I have My Little Pony in the trade form, and then I've also got it in single issues, and, you know, different purposes, different things, so they access that different ways. But, you know, it's less important about having that be complete, because it's more of a browsing kind of a thing, you know, little kids like that sort of thing.
And what percentage of your budget do you put towards graphic novels?
I couldn't tell you percentage-wise.
Well, Jason is kind of, I would say, proven winner and the ruler of the domain at his library. But at my library, I really had to broker. Turn off your ears for a second. It is but to weep for how small my budget actually is, because even though we are like the system hub and everybody's like, oh, Central Library, it's really not that big a deal. Our entire budget for our division is $11,000, and that we collect teen fiction, and we collect teen nonfiction, and we collect teen magazines, and so I also buy the comics and the manga out of that, and so I have a budget that is somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000 for the year.
I might say a rough guess might be around.
What's that?
That's like my whole budget.
Might
Okay.
be around, I'd say maybe around 10% of my total budget, including AV. So of just the book budget, maybe it's more like 15% or so. It depends too, because we are limited somewhat in space, so I can't get everything that I want. I would my dream library is one that has as much space for comics as it does for J fiction, but, you know,
To put things in perspective, the literature division of the library spends, one person has a budget of $30,000. They buy some of the books in that division, not all.
let me just,
So-
before we quit, let me just get your question.
I just have one question, is there another word you use instead of comic?
Yeah,
You can
people
track
ask
it, you
about
can-
that.
You don't follow to kinda get the same kind of stuff.
Comics, graphic novels, I tend to cater that to the audience. When I talk about kids' comics, I talk about comics. Graphic novels, I'll talk about that in relation to teens or adults. It means the same thing. I would say graphic novel, some people might say comics is like single issues versus, you know, collections of things. But, you know, it's really,
In
you
my
know.
library, I have a huge banner that says graphic novels,
Right.
because I wanna be taken seriously, it's for teenagers. If you say comics, people don't take it as seriously.
But I call everything comics, you know, I think, I wanna say in France, they call them, it's called BD, it's like, you know, Band-Aid, Désigné, I don't know the French word for it, but it essentially means like strips, you know, like illustrated strips, so it's not like the word, they're not all funny, but it's just, that's, sometimes you call a thing, and so a lot of people who are in the comics world just call everything comics, but outside of the comics world, librarians, they will distinguish between comics and graphic novels. So please, come up
Yes,
while
we-
this is happening,
we
look
brought-
at, we brought tons of stuff.
Instead of being powerful, we just brought stuff for you to touch.
Help justify us lugging it all in here, so come
So
look.
come look, and I'll holler out your names and we'll gather up everybody's ticket, and then you can also take ones that are wrapped.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll tell you guys.
Oh,
I
I do have
ILL
one-
because it costs $100.
Sorry, one really quick thing, if I have everybody's attention, really quick. I've got here, this is Halloween Comics Fest. This is a programming thing. You can get, I get these from my local comics person. It's 25 comics and it's $5 for this batch here. So they're like 20 cents each. We have a Halloween program. They do this every year. We pass these out to the kids. It's very cheap and a great way to get comics in
What
the
did
hands
you
of
call it
kids.
again?
It's called Halloween Comics Fest. I'm not sure if you can order directly from them or if you have to go through the comic shop. You might be able to because I think they do it through Diamond.
There's something called National Free Comic Book Day that happens in May, and it's been such a great
Right, that's
thing
another
for
thing, too.
business. And they're like, let's have one in the fall. So they have a thing for Halloween.
I had writers the other day, and I had writers the other day. The reason I'm here is because of readers like that. Well, I mean, they're trying to get comics and I guess create a database, publishers, everything. He's gonna come in because I have a
Fred,
and he's actually, some of his stuff is focused on literature.
you need to pick a bundle.
If, you know, Future Farmers of America
Not the chair, one bundle.
advertise, you know,
Pick a bundle.
something, they have that, they're trying to put that in their database. So, and it's a volunteer project.
You don't get to choose a lot of time.
No.
I did not hear you mention if that was for Furry Freak Brothers or Fat Freddy's Cat. Those are from the 60s. I still have
I
them.
haven't heard of that.
It's for hotheads and they're cockroach and cat. Eating cat, yes.
What's it called?
Fat Freddy's Cat and also the Furry Freak Brothers.
Oh, wow, that's funny.
Phineas. It's been a while. I don't. My
there's a
ex-husband
lot-
has them under
There's a lot of good
lock.
stuff out there, and I think as the market, you know, the thing that's a bummer about that is that, you know, there's a limited market for it, and so you gotta get